This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal, and I'm Jess Khanam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, weeks after the apartheid regime of Israel catastrophically destroyed Gaza, killing over 60 children and with the death toll over 200 and thousands injured, with tens of thousands of buildings destroyed, we continue to see the devastation being wrought to the Palestinians living in Gaza. Yet at the same time, the apartheid regime is in the midst of its own political chaos, and it looks like we're trading one war criminal for yet another. Benjamin Netanyahu is on the ropes politically, Jamal, and we have Naftali Bennett, an avowed racist individual who has bragged about killing Palestinians openly and advocated for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in historic Palestine and everywhere, set to become the next prime minister of the apartheid regime, along with a new president. So there's a big shakeup across the political spectrum for the apartheid regime, Jamal.
You're absolutely right. And actually, the president was elected, Isaac Herzog. This is someone in 2018 when he was named Jewish Agency chair. Right. He called mixed marriages and relationships between Jews and non-Jews as a plague. I mean, that's why when you say he's a racist, even within the Israeli media, they will tell you that. But we will talk about this and more, and we'll talk about Naftali Bennett, who seems to be the heir apparent to Bibi Netanyahu. Later on, we have a great guest who will be talking to us, Max Blumenthal, a bona fide journalist for many years. And he has written a very interesting article in the Gray Zone titled "To Distract from Gaza Slaughter, Israel Lobby Manufactures Anti-Semitism Freak Out." Let's listen to Max Blumenthal. To distract from Gaza slaughter, Israel lobby manufactures anti-Semitism freak out. This is the title of an article by Max Blumenthal, the editor-in-chief of the Gray Zone. Max is an award-winning journalist and the author of several books, including best-selling Republican Gomorrah, Goliath, The 51-Day War, and The Management of Savagery. Welcome again to Arab Talk, Max.
Great to be here.
So this title will certainly raise eyebrows and anger many supporters of Israel. In this article, you accuse the Israel lobby of deceptively editing videos and making up dubious allegations, manufacturing an anti-Semitism epidemic to turn the media's gaze away from the dead children in Gaza. Please explain, Max.
The interesting thing about this article is that it was widely disseminated. It basically went viral because it spoke to what so many people knew to be true and provided them with, the facts and the evidence. But, on the pro-Israel side, there was no real coherent response to the piece. They didn't respond on the merits. What they did was they would just denounce the article as another example of anti-Semitism. And what I did with this article was examine in a forensic manner the video evidence that Zionists were relying on, as well as the witness testimony and the even mainstream print media accounts, to show that the key incidents that formed the linchpin of this narrative of a wave of anti-Semitism were not anti-Semitic incidents at all. There was no example I could find of Palestine solidarity protesters going out and hunting down Jews, or anyone getting angry about what Israel was doing in and around Gaza and looking for Jews to hunt. In almost every case, while you could say maybe some of these pro-Palestine activists were angry and resorted to some stupid behavior, it was in the context of a scuffle with pro-Israel forces who were doing the same, or who were actually violently attacking Palestine activists, instigating these incidents. and provoking them with verbal attacks. So no one really bothered to do this on the other side. And I also found that the mainstream media, CNN especially, which was rolling out the red carpet for the main Israel lobby group pushing this narrative, the Anti-Defamation League, which we could better describe as the Arab Defamation League or just the Defamation League, they were actually deceptively editing video of various incidents to make it seem like Jews were just being attacked in the street by these mobs of kufiya-wearing Arabs, and they were not showing the full video that showed that in one major case, the person who claimed to be a victim was actually lying about the circumstances.
I want to talk about this case because I think you listed several cases. This is a May 19th incident in Midtown, New York City. And this is the one you're referring to that I think it was Don Lemon who did a piece on it. And it is by supposedly a mob of Palestinian youth hunted down and brutalized a lone Jewish man. His name is Joseph Borgen, on his way to a nearby pro-Israel rally. Then he had an interview on Don Lemon. And this became the incident, what you refer to as wearing the yarmulke, which he wasn't. He had a hoodie on.
Yeah. I mean, the central basis for Joseph Borgen, this 23-year-old man from Long Island who came to Times Square to go to a pro-Israel rally, for his claim that he was beaten because he was Jewish walking through Times Square by these basically they're Palestinian young men who were infuriated by Israel's assault on Gaza. His claim was that he was wearing a kippah, a Jewish skull cap, and they targeted him as a Jew, not because he was a pro-Israel demonstrator. And the reality was, if you look at the video carefully, and then I found photographs, very clear photographs of the aftermath of the incident. He was wearing a hoodie that was a gray hooded sweatshirt, fully secure on his head, that would have covered up any kippah. He showed no sign of Jewish religious garb. There was no way to tell he was Jewish. And if you examine local media reports about what was happening there at that time, multiple witnesses said that pro-Israel forces were throwing juice bottles and water bottles out the window at pro-Palestinian marchers, provoking them into a fight. Several witnesses who were there at this particular incident said that pro-Israel forces actually attacked a young Palestinian man named Wassim Awaude, who he was already injured. He was on crutches, and because they attacked him, his friends started getting really angry, and Borgen got beat up, including by Awaude, who hit him once with a crutch. And so police were on the scene. Everybody else ran away, and Awaude was unable to get away because he was on crutches. So they caught him. They've charged him with a hate crime. You could look at like local New York media, and there's all this video of him doing a perp walk. They basically portrayed him as a terrorist, and no one has responded to my analysis of the incident, which shows that it's pretty clearly not a hate crime. It shatters the whole narrative. I thought, if I report this and I get it wrong, I'm going to get destroyed because I'm denying this hate crime. But no one has responded to me. So it's pretty obvious that the narrative is 180 degrees. The reality is 180 degrees different than the narrative.
And then you have another incident also with two, Israeli soldiers who had served in the Golani Brigades, a special forces division that participated in the Israel's 2014 assault on Gaza. And this was also a whole different narrative. They were basically the perpetrators, not the other way around.
This was one of the first videos that started really gaining cachet online. And it purported to show these two Israelis who were being attacked by a Palestinian mob in Midtown on the same day, around the same time, in the same atmosphere, and that they were being beaten and they had to fight for their lives because they were overheard speaking Hebrew. And that's what one of them said. And first of all, The video was deceptively edited, just like the other one. And I looked at the full video, and parts had been cut out that showed one of these Israelis taunting the Palestinians and screaming, long live the state of Israel, as he was being hauled away into a police van, and that the police were arresting him because he instigated the violence. The video, if you look at it closely, shows the two Israelis punching the Palestinians first. And then I looked at their background. I went to their Facebook pages after learning their names. They were Golani Brigade Special Forces soldiers, trained killers who participated in the 2014 assault on Gaza, and were both martial arts experts, trained in mixed martial arts. One of them is actually the grandson of one of the men who helped popularize martial arts in Israel. And this young man, his name is Amit Skornik, he started a GoFundMe to raise money after this highly publicized incident, showing pictures of him punching Palestinians along with his friend, and it said, "Jews fight back finally." And the money was to go to the Golani Brigade in Israel, which was potentially going to invade the Gaza Strip. Finally, these two characters went on Israeli media to brag about beating up Palestinians, while in English language media on Fox News, they're pretending to be these innocent victims. So once again, you have an absurd distortion of reality in which two Israeli trained killers physically attacked Palestinians, and then they were portrayed as the victims of a hate crime.
So the ADL reporting a whopping 193 anti-Semitic incidents in basically the span of a week. How many, in your assessment, were correct and the others were manufactured?
Well, there were some reports of like swastikas that were scrawled on like bathroom stalls, and every incident that the ADL records is something that someone emails them or calls in. It can be anonymous, and they don't check it. They don't try to corroborate it or determine if it's true. They just chalk it up. Then they send the data out to the media and they say there's a wave of anti-Semitism, and they tell their constituents, we are fighting this uptick in anti-Semitism. Please send us money. It's just a giant fundraising operation. And I think some of them might be true, where somebody writes a swastika in a bathroom stall, or somebody yells something at a Jew. But what they were trying to do after Israel was militarily and politically humiliated on the world stage was to distract from that by conflating Palestine solidarity activism with anti-Semitism. And so in ADL's report, some of the major incidents that they defined as anti-Semitic were simply Palestine rallies, people calling for the equal rights of Palestinians, people chanting Intifada. That was one anti-Semitic incident. So what they've done is what they've been trying to do for so long in the US and also in the UK and France, criminalize Palestine solidarity activism. And that's what makes it so dangerous when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris come out and answer the ADL's call to denounce anti-Semitism. What they're really doing is denouncing all of us who were outraged to see entire families being exterminated in the Gaza Strip, or people's homes being stolen from them in Sheikh Jarrah.
Now, you used two examples about how basically the ADL functions. One, you use the example of the Israeli filmmaker Yoav Shamir in his 2009 documentary on the weaponization of anti-Semitism, which I thought, I haven't watched the documentary, but I thought this was very interesting. And then the other thing that I followed very closely was the U.S.-Israel lobby's cynical manufacturing of a wave of anti-Semitism, that you linked it with what happened in Britain with the UK, with the removal of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the UK's Labour Party. I mean, how did you make that connection? What exactly happened?
Well, the documentary Defamation by Yoav Shamir is simply the best film on anti-Semitism and its exploitation and exaggeration by powerful forces, the Israeli government and the Israel lobby in the US. Shamir got access to the ADL. They opened up their offices to him because he was Israeli. And he went there and he said, I would like to know more about this wave of anti-Semitism that you're speaking about, because as usual, that then director of the ADL, Abe Foxman, was howling about this uptick in anti-Semitism to raise money. And he went to their offices. He said, show me some of these incidents, and then I'm going to go out in the field with my camera and track them down and show people what's happening. And then the incidents that they described were just absurd. Somebody called in and complained that about mean media coverage of Israel. Somebody said that they couldn't get days off on the Jewish holiday of Shavuot. And he said he couldn't find one incident that he could track down. They were unable to even find the people who made these complaints. And that's what we're seeing today. And then what we saw in the UK was a politician rise to the leadership through this massive wave of grassroots support of the Labour Party, one of the two major parties in the UK. Jeremy Corbyn, someone who is a lifelong anti-racist and supporter of Palestinian rights. He actually hosted me in Parliament when I first visited the UK on a speaking tour after the assault on Gaza in 2014. And that event was used as one of the first attacks on Jeremy Corbyn. I was described with no evidence as a Holocaust denier. It was absurd, and this made it to the major tabloids in the UK. As soon as Corbyn became Labour leader, the Israel lobby and the Israeli embassy, through its paid assets, began painting him as an anti-Semite with no evidence. He didn't fight back. There was very little pushback. There was a lot of fear. The Labour Party was purged of Palestine solidarity supporters, especially people of color like Jackie Walker, who was called an anti-Semite because she referred to the slavery Middle Passage as an African Holocaust, which it was. And the next thing you know, the Labour Party has been completely destroyed, and you have in its leadership position a ultra-Zionist with deep ties to the British national security state, someone who participated in the persecution of Julian Assange, who has the charisma of a filing cabinet, Sir Keir Starmer. And that's the program that they seek to institute in the US to prevent us from making any political headway here. We have all become Jeremy Corbyn. And if we don't call this out and push back and call it out right away and not be afraid to do so, then we will be driven into political ruin.
Now, talking about, you mentioning Abraham Foxman, he's the National Director Emeritus of the Anti-Defamation League. He publicly canceled his subscription to the New York Times, explaining in a tweet, "Today's blood libel of Israel and the Jewish people on the front page is enough." He later on elaborated in an email to a publication, I think it's called the Allgemeiner. The reason was the paper's bias against Israel. And of course, he didn't mention that the New York Times also displayed the pictures of the Jewish Israeli kids who were killed due to Hamas firing rockets. I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, if a newspaper, which, by the way, we should also mention that the New York Times did not publish these pictures until Haaretz, the Israeli paper, also did that. I mean, if they recognize the faces of the victims, I mean, how's that blood libel?
I mean, I've seen major pro-Israel figures claim that everyone who was killed in the Gaza Strip was killed as the result of misfired rockets by Hamas. Actually, I've seen the Israeli government's spokespeople have been saying this, and I assume Foxman believes some version of it. I've seen people attempt to claim that some of the children's faces were fake on the cover of the New York Times. I really believe people like Foxman's brains are so warped, and they compartmentalize so thoroughly when Israel carries out these exterminationist waves of violence on the besieged Gaza Strip that they actually don't believe that that many children are killed, and they truly believe that it's a lie. In any case, this is the behavior that Foxman has been displaying for decades, and for the first time, he really hasn't gotten away with it. It's partly because of the proliferation of social media that common people like you and me, who have no real voice in mainstream media, can call him out. But it's also because the situation became so unbearable and Israel's assaults became so grotesque that even the New York Times was forced to acknowledge what we always knew was taking place in Palestine. So it's sort of a new day, and the Israel lobby is going to have to find new ways of trying to propagandize people. What they're turning to increasingly is, the campaign they developed in like 2006, Brand Israel, with the pink washing and the green washing and, woke Zionism, and that Hamas is, oppressing women. And they'll try to do that, but it just doesn't work anymore. And increasingly Zionism is a cause for, right-wing people who intend to be Republican, and believe, as Barry Weiss said, that one of the obligations of Zionism is killing children.
Wow. Well, I should also, we were talking about the New York Times, that the New York Times own Bret Stephens, he's the also op-ed columnist. He wrote a piece just before, actually, not too long before those pictures were published, saying that the accusations made against Israel, stealing Palestinian land, etc., he ends his sentence by saying, "Can't help but make me think of ancient libels about Jewish greed and bloodlust."
This is someone, Bret Stephens, who said when a professor called at George Washington University called him a bed bug, he called it an anti-Semitic slur. And he dug up a piece. He had a researcher look for one example of Nazis calling Jews bed bugs, and he falsely interpreted a historical report from some pogrom. I mean, this is just one of the most privileged, entitled, secure people in the entire world, whose whole career has been fostered by the Israel lobby, who has never had to display a shred of talent to get where he is, who's currently being paid by an Israel lobby group in violation of the New York Times ethics policy. And he's claiming that he is an oppressed victim in order to provide cover to an apartheid army to continue slaughtering people who live in a besieged ghetto. It just simply doesn't get any more absurd than Bret Stephens. And it's why I personally felt bitter when I saw the New York Times publish those photos of the children on its cover, because the New York Times on every other day has provided Israel with all the means it needs to propagandize readers, and has promoted regime change against every country that has stood up for Palestine at the UN or on the world stage with completely fake stories. So the New York Times doesn't deserve any plaudits. And I don't see this as a giant sea change as long as people like Bret Stephens are continuing to publish their filth on its pages.
Do you think that Israel surrogates in the U.S. are losing their Hasbara or propaganda war? I mean, is this why they are falling back on labeling critics of Israel of being anti-Semitic?
Well, they always have done this. I mean, I was number 8 on the Simon Wiesenthal's list of top 10 anti-Semites in 2013, or maybe it was 2014. And then the following year, I made number 4. Ayatollah Khamenei was always number 1. I could never.
I had to do this, but I should mention that you are Jewish. I mean.
Yeah, in case it isn't obvious from my name.
If it's not, but this is ludicrous. One last question. I don't know if it's going to make any difference, but it seems that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be replaced by Bennett, whose family hails from San Francisco. Do you see any changes on the horizon in Israeli politics?
Well, I do. But I mean, just addressing it in terms of the special relationship, I think this is for anyone who believes that the situation should change in favor of humanity, this is actually a positive development, because the worst wars on Palestine have been waged, other than the 2014 war and the most recent one, by people who came from outside Likud, Ehud Barak, Ariel Sharon, when he became part of the Kadima party, and then Ehud Olmert. So the Likud party does not have a monopoly on grotesque crimes. And the whole project of ethnic cleansing was launched by the Labour Party. So it really makes no difference to me who's in power. What the issue is that Netanyahu has a long-standing relationship with power brokers in Washington dating back to the 1980s. He's a product actually of the US and the US Republican Party. He's someone who is able to communicate Israel's position very effectively and deceptively on the world stage. Naftali Bennett does not have those qualities, although he speaks perfect English. He's very right-wing. He's more connected to the settlement movement. He's overtly religious. He wears a skull cap and a knit skull cap to identify with the settlement movement. And he's going to have a much more difficult time covering up the real Israel that you and I know, but many Americans are unfamiliar with. And it is a sectarian, racist, extremely violent Israel. He is the perfect embodiment of that. And so I think this is actually a refreshing development.
Wow, this is actually a very different viewpoint, which is very accurate, actually. Max Blumenthal, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, that's the voice and the face of Max Blumenthal, reporter, journalist, and author. And I have to tell you, Jamal, I mean, Max Blumenthal has always been an impressive writer and analyst, and uncovered some of the best stories having to do with Israeli atrocities and their apartheid system. But this particular article, only he could write. If you and I were trying to write something like this, it wouldn't be well received. But what Max Blumenthal is able to articulate, and we all agree that, acts of anti-Semitism are unacceptable and, never should be tolerated. But he's talking about the use of anti-Semitism in the service of distracting from the atrocities that the apartheid regime in Israel has committed and continues to commit. It's a very powerful article.
It's very powerful. It's he really talks about the weaponizing of anti-Semitism. And in particular, he names ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and he cites many examples. He draws parallel with what happened in the US, for example, with what happened in the UK with the Corbyn, who basically the Israel lobby labeled as an anti-Semite, just concocted charges after charges, leading to basically his ouster from the Labour Party leadership. And then, of course, with the recent incidents that the ADL were citing, he basically debunks all these claims, story after story, and interviews after interviews, like the one that Don Lemon had someone interviewed without checking his background, and then the real video shows that he was the perpetrator and he wasn't attacked because he was wearing a skull cap. In fact, he was wearing a hoodie, so people would not have been able to tell whether he's Jewish or not. And then another story that involves Jess, two Israeli soldiers, that Max Blumenthal found out about their identity, that they actually served they were highly trained, in combat, they were in the Golani Brigade, which is one of Israel's most popular killing machines. And then they were acting as the victims when they were the perpetrators. So it's not like someone who doesn't know what's going on, who hasn't investigated this before, who has not done documentaries in Palestine. Max Blumenthal, very reputable journalist. And by the way, you said something, I need to correct you a little bit, because you said only Max Blumenthal can write this because he can get away with it. But I mean, the caveat, of course, everyone knows Max Blumenthal is Jewish, which we don't like to put these labels. However, he's listed, according to him, as now the number 4 anti-Semite on the, I guess, the ADL list or something like that.
Oh, really?
I mean, imagine. Yeah, so
Really?
it's no longer, it's no longer the self-hating Jew label, but now they're just labeling him like anyone else. I mean, when they don't have an answer to someone, that's the easy label.
Well,
the thing
that I like about his argument is the concept of weaponizing anti-Semitism, because what this does, in fact, is kind of minimize tragically, and has the impact of really not taking seriously as it should be the kinds of anti-Semitism which we all condemn, obviously. And it kind of lays bare the technique of the ADL and other pro-Israel forces to pull this out as a weapon of denial and as a weapon to silence critics of the apartheid regime of Israel. And so, we don't like to use those labels, obviously, Jamal, about Max, but Max can write these kinds of articles with deep knowledge of culture, of the environment, and of the use of anti-Semitism for unfortunately for political gains, which, hurts all the people who are truly victims.
I mean, look what happened. We talked about this in prior shows to Dua Lipa, Gigi Hadid, and her sister Bella Hadid for just basically criticizing Israel's onslaught on Gaza. They had a full-page ad in the New York Times labeling them as promoting anti-Semitism. I mean, if you criticize Israel, if you criticize their atrocity, if you say something pro-Palestinian, you're automatically labeled as an anti-Semite. And this is what actually Max Blumenthal has exposed in his article.
Yes, and it's going to need to be exposed even more, Jamal, because we've talked about this, and we're going to be transitioning to a longer discussion about this. The Hasbara weapons that the Israeli Hasbara machine has are dwindling. The entire international community, minus the United States, well, even to some extent, to a minimal extent, the United States has condemned the war crimes and the atrocities committed against Palestinian children and civilians in Gaza by U.S.-made weapons. It seems the whole world has criticized the regime for their atrocities. The ICC will investigate. It's been labeled an apartheid regime by Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem. So they have nothing left to defend their atrocities, Jamal. So they're pulling out arguably could be one of their last Hasbara weapons, which is to label any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, which is, ridiculous, because most of these critics now happen to be, Jewish, to say the least.
Yeah, and the list is growing as far as the critics, whether Jewish Americans like members of Jewish Voice for Peace here, politicians, you have hundreds of musicians recently signed a petition to stop, weaponizing basically Israel and sending money to Israel. And then you have demonstrations, I think 1,000+ people demonstrating in Washington, D.C., right at the footsteps of the Capitol, demanding that the U.S. taxpayer should start questioning all that money that is going to Israel for basically its killing machine, which is killing children and killing civilians.
Exactly, Jamal. And speaking of that, Lindsey Graham visiting the apartheid regime on taxpayer money, on U.S. taxpayer money, meeting with Benjamin.
His trip could have been also comped by AIPAC. So
he's still a U.S. senator. He's still a U.S. senator. He's still a U.S. senator, Jamal, and he met with Benjamin Netanyahu, who's being indicted for many felonies right now in corruption. And lo and behold, he announces that it looks like the Israeli regime is going to ask for another $1 billion in taxpayer money from the U.S. government. When will it stop, Jamal?
I mean, this is, and the
How
timing
insulting.
of it, the most ridiculous trip that I've seen from a U.S. senator. And I mean, it looks so obvious he's going there just to lobby on behalf of Israel, lobby Congress and lobby the Senate to write them another $1 billion check on top of their $3.8 billion that they receive annually. And guess why? This is to replace or replenish Israeli missiles, the missiles they used on Gaza, basically to kill children. Said, no, this is for the Iron Dome. I mean, here's the joke about the Iron Dome. And this is something why the United States is going to keep paying for it. And not the United States, the taxpayer, really, the American taxpayer will be paying for it time and time again. It costs $40 to $60 million per battery.
Unbelievable.
You know, it costs thousands of dollars each time they launch a missile, which, by the way, I've read a lot of reports. Israel exaggerates its accuracy.
Yeah, it doesn't
and
work.
And that's
really.
why many of the cheap Hamas missiles, which are basically Katyusha rockets or improved or enhanced Katyusha rockets to penetrate, it's a very costly system that every time you have these issues going on, then Israel takes the credit for developing the so-called the Iron Dome or working on the Iron Dome. And then the United States ends up paying for it. So every time, whether Israel engages Hamas in Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon, Israel is going to come back to you, to me, to every American in this country and say, here is the bill. Write us a check.
So my question to the citizens of the United States, Jamal, now that you have international recognition of the Israeli regime as an apartheid regime, as practicing apartheid, why are we, as citizens of the United States, with all of the economic infrastructure difficulties, the healthcare costs, the bridges that are falling apart, the roads that are falling apart, the 30 million children that go to bed hungry every night in the United States, Jamal, why are we supporting an apartheid regime with $4+ billion every year when that money could be spent right here in the United States?
Millions of Americans remain unemployed. I mean,
exactly.
The weeds of the economy have not started to spin. I mean, we're just barely kind of trying to recover from COVID. To have some other country come to you and say, give me $1 billion when we can use the $1 billion internally to feed all these homeless people who are now in the streets in the United States. I mean, look how ridiculous is this. I mean,
well, it's ridiculous, but I'm also saying something in addition to the ridiculousness, Jamal. It's the fact that we're propping up an apartheid regime, and we're tacitly, if not expressly, supporting what the ICC anticipates as being war crimes being committed against Palestinian children and civilians in Gaza. Yet this country's foreign policy continues to support this murderous regime without any questions, without any issues, without even a wink. And now we have a U.S. Senator, Lindsey Graham, who I believe should be registered as a foreign agent, lobbying on behalf of the Israeli government for $1 billion more. There's something really wrong with that picture, Jamal.
I mean, I don't see Lindsey Graham walking in the streets of Atlanta or the streets of Dallas, Texas, or Los Angeles, and going to the poor neighborhoods and saying, we're going to raise $1 billion, or we're going to bring you $1 billion worth of financial aid or whatever. In fact, they've been like throwing monkey wrenches in front of President Biden on his stimulus package. I mean,
exactly.
And now he's just like, we're going to give them $1 billion. I hope the Senate Congress, whoever is responsible, will deny that request when it arrives.
We can only hope, Jamal, but I think this is part of the larger picture that we're hoping that the citizens of the United States, of this country, will pay attention to, because when you read about the political earthquake that's happening in the Israeli political world, when you have an avowed racist, hater of people of color, Naftali Bennett, most likely becoming the next prime minister of this regime, you really need to do a double take, because here's an individual whose parents were born in the United States, an individual who moved to the United States.
From where, Jess? From where? He was born in Haifa, but his parents
are from New York.
No, from San Francisco.
Oh, San Francisco. Okay.
Okay. The origin of the family is from Poland. That's
the original location.
But they were living right here in San Francisco and immigrated in 1967 from the San Francisco Bay Area to Haifa, where he was born. I mean,
so here but Naftali Bennett, let's be clear, Jamal. He also lived on illegally stolen Palestinian land in these white colonies that they call settlements, which are illegal colonies living on stolen Palestinian land. Now he lives in a very expensive suburb of Tel Aviv, but he's basically the leader of the white extreme racist political movement in Israel now, Jamal, and he struck a deal with the so-called, what do we call it? I don't want to call it liberal party, but whatever's left of the Israeli political spectrum, he's aligning himself with these two political opposites, are aligning themselves to get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu. And my statement to the Israelis, as well as to the United States, to Joe Biden and Antony Blinken, you really are going to support this avowed racist to be the prime minister of the Israeli regime? Come on, say something.
I mean, for one thing, he made it very clear, not once but several times, that he opposes a Palestinian state.
Full stop.
He said
he's against the two-state solution.
He also, when he talks in Hebrew, you have to listen to him in Hebrew, not in English. He refers to Eretz Israel, which is Greater Israel. This is not the Israel that you have today. I mean, he's talking, those are the old maps that the Irgun and Haganah had, showing Israel that included Jordan going all the way to Egypt and to the Euphrates River.
That's right.
That's the Greater Israel. He wants a Greater Israel. So forget about peace negotiations or that for Palestinians to have equal rights. And he said it a million times that Israel belongs to the Jews and no one else. He also bragged, and this is his own words, saying, I already killed lots of Arabs in my life and there is absolutely no problem with that. So this is someone who also bragged that, bragged the killing of
Jabal,
Palestinians.
he was involved in the Kana massacre, where hundreds of Palestinians were massacred in Lebanon.
Yeah, so, I mean, he has a history. Of course, I mean, if you're talking about his political career, I mean, he's certainly, I wouldn't call him a Netanyahu light. He is actually a Netanyahu times
Heavy.
10. I mean,
he's a MAGA Netanyahu.
I mean, he made his entire political career basically serving Benjamin Netanyahu. He was,
but to the right. He was
Minister of Economy in Netanyahu's government, Minister of Religious Services, Minister of the Diaspora Affairs, Minister of Education, and Minister of Defense before he turned and stabbed Bibi in the back. I mean, that's the game that he played. He was always, on the right of Benjamin Netanyahu, and then eventually he went and turned against him, and now he wants to replace him.
So my question to you, Jamal, now that you have Joe Biden, President Biden, being somewhat cool to Benjamin Netanyahu, we now have the real possibility of a right-wing murderous extremist becoming the new prime minister. What will the Biden administration and the rest of the world community, the EU, and the rest of the world community stand and do in the face of this potential new right-wing extremism that's even worse than the Netanyahu extremism that's really going around still, Jamal, saying death to Arabs, still trying to lynch Palestinians who are so-called citizens and they're, Israeli citizens, trying to lynch them, hundreds of whom are still in jail from peacefully protesting what was happening in Gaza.
That's what they'll do. They'll roll out the red carpet for him, just like they did with Menachem Begin, who was a terrorist, before 1948, just like they did with Shamir, who was also a terrorist, a wanted terrorist for murder, and both of them responsible for the bombing of the King David Hotel. They were made as heroes and peacemakers. Same thing with Sharon, who was behind Sabra and Shatila. I mean, I don't expect anything else. I mean, this is going to be the attitude. The only way you can put pressure on these governments and leaders is the grassroots movement that's happening now. Voices, well-known faces and voices who speak against the atrocities. But I mean, if you went and looked at our Senate now, they will welcome, they will welcome Bennett just like they welcomed Netanyahu before. I mean, I don't see anything different. What, less than 2 people maybe will be against him, 3 people, but you're not going to have the masses in government.
But this will be interesting for a couple of reasons, Jamal, because there is pressure coming from the more progressive elements of the Senate and the House about this support, this kind of unquestioned support for the apartheid regime of Israel. So you'll see mobilization on the left, both in the House and the Senate, which really in the Senate, I'm talking about Bernie Sanders and maybe a handful of some other senators, but a greater number of people in the House who are really going to press the Biden administration if Naftali Bennett does become the prime minister. So it'll be interesting. Now, another thing that I wanted to ask you about, we can't just focus on Israeli politics, Jamal. There's been a resurgence of Palestinian unity across the world spectrum of where Palestinians are living. We're talking about Palestinians in 1948, Palestinians in Gaza, West Bank, in the camps, and throughout the diaspora seem to be participating in a global sense of unity right now, unlike anything we've seen in decades.
You're right. You're right. I mean, we've seen them, 1948 Palestinians. We've seen all over the world. I mean, yes, this kind of, I would say, brought Palestinian unity. It also marginalized the Palestinian Authority. I mean
even more.
Nobody pays attention to Mahmoud Abbas. I mean, people are now questioning that role that the Palestinian Authority has, and in many cases also the independent Palestinian voices, Trump Hamas leadership, the Trump Fatah leadership. So I don't know if this is going to continue. I mean, there is a momentum now, and which is good. I don't know if they're going to keep up the pressure. I've noticed recently things have calmed down a little bit, even though Israel continues to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and in Silwan. I think
that hasn't stopped, though, Jamal.
It hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped, and that's why I would say this is the time to kind of to keep the pressure, because in many, in many aspects, what happened in Gaza, and it was horrible. It kind of, and I talked to Max Blumenthal about that. It took the spotlight away from what's going on in these Jerusalem neighborhoods, because this is a part and parcel of Israel's systemic plan of ethnically cleansing Jerusalem, and because, they say this is the eternal capital, and to build on what Trump has done by moving the embassy and some other actually countries that moved their embassies into Jerusalem, and they're trying to kind of like rewrite history and say Palestinians don't exist in Jerusalem, and this is And talking about that, actually, because we have few minutes, I wanted not to forget about the story, just which is I call it the Hassan Bek Mosque. It was really embarrassing. I don't know if you watched that to see the UAE ambassador to Israel getting blessed by their chief rabbi in, I guess, Tel Aviv, and saying, oh, I'm surprised because he went to Tel Aviv that there is a mosque in Tel Aviv. And then, of course, everyone just went berserk over this statement to show that his ignorance all over, the social media.
Unbelievable.
And just a couple of things about this mosque in Hassan Bek Mosque. It was built in 1916.
Hello.
Okay, so it existed in 1916. For those who are interested, go to my Facebook page, facebook.com, Jamal Dajani 2. You'll see pictures of the mosque pre-1948. And the sad thing about it, it was in a 100% Palestinian neighborhood, suburb, or a neighborhood of Jaffa called Al-Manshiyah. And then Israel destroyed Al-Manshiyah completely in 1948. And then annexed it to Tel Aviv, and then left the mosque standing. So, I don't know, we're going to post this picture actually on the show to see the three pictures. And just the embarrassment and the ignorance by the ambassador of the UAE is just unforgivable.
Yeah, Jamal, not only is it unforgivable, what about the so-called Abraham Accords, where you had Gulf countries remaining silent during the time of the murder of Palestinian children and civilians in Gaza, having this accord to kind of normalize relations with this regime that is murdering Palestinians every day. I guess this is the beauty of the Kushner peace plan, that he was able to find Arabs in the Gulf who support the regime that are killing Palestinians. What's up with that?
That's why this incident was crazy. This is a time when people across the globe have been mourning Palestinian children. Palestinian children, for the very first time, their faces and stories were on the New York Times and other publications. And then this guy goes there and acts like so grateful that Israel kept a mosque standing. It's
after they ethnically cleansed Palestinians. Yeah. Well, I'm sure we're going to be continuing with all these stories, Jamal. The next time we have Arab Talk, Naftali Bennett could be the next prime minister of the apartheid regime.
Or even during the airing of this show. You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest episodes. And we'll talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.